Welcome to another deep dive. You ready to get into some international law today?
Absolutely. Always up for a good legal challenge.
Well, it looks like our listener definitely brought the challenge this time. Articles, textbook excerpts, even some court cases.
Wow, someone did their homework.
They sure did. It seems like they really want to understand not just the basics, but some of the trickier aspects of international law, how it actually works in the real world, and, if all the concepts we talk about really belong under that umbrella.
Yeah, I can see that. It's not always black and white.
Exactly. And one thing that stood out to me going through these sources was just the sheer number of definitions for international law.
Right. Everyone seems to have their own take.
It can get pretty confusing. Luckily, we have an expert here to help us make sense of it all. Joining us today is, our expert in international law.
Happy to be here. And you're right, it can seem like a maze, but once you understand the basic principles, it starts to make more sense.
So let's start with those definitions. I mean, were there any that really stood out to you from all the ones our listeners sent in?
Yeah, there were a couple that really resonated with me. One described international law as the aggregate of various principles, norms, rules, and institutions, governing relations between states and other international actors.
Okay, so it's not just a set of rules, it's a whole system.
Exactly. It's a complex web of interactions. Now, another definition, and this one was a bit more cynical, described international law as the law which the wicked do not obey and which the righteous do not enforce.
Oof, that's a bit harsh, isn't it?
Well, it's definitely provocative, but it highlights a key difference between international law and domestic law. You see, domestically, you have police and courts to enforce the law. Internationally, it's more about cooperation, consensus, pressure from the international community.
So just because there's a rule doesn't mean everyone will follow it.
Unfortunately not.
Hmm.
Enforcement is one of the biggest challenges in international law.
I bet. I'm also seeing a lot about different schools of thought on the basis of international law in these sources, like the natural law school and the positivist school.
Right, those are two of the major perspectives. The natural law school sees international law as grounded in universal moral principles. It's the idea that there's a global sense of right and wrong.
Like a kind of inherent morality.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, the positivist school emphasizes the consent of states. In this view, international law only exists because states agree to be bound by it, usually through treaties or long-standing customary practices.
So one is about inherent morality, and the other is about what states have actually agreed to.
You got it. And these different perspectives have a huge impact on how international law is understood and applied in practice.
Okay, so we've got all these different definitions, different schools of thought. How does this actually play out in the real world? One thing that really caught my attention in the listener sources was how the Philippines incorporates international law into its own legal system.
Right. That's a great example of how international and domestic law can intersect. Many countries, including the Philippines, have mechanisms for integrating international legal principles into their own domestic frameworks. Sometimes it's written right into their constitutions. Other times it happens through specific legislation.
So it's not just international law existing out there in the abstract. It can actually affect a country's own laws and court decisions.
Absolutely. And there's actually a really interesting case from the Philippines that highlights this. A case involving a law requiring labor organizations to register with the government. The question was, did this law conflict with international human rights standards?
Ooh, that sounds complicated. What happened?
Well, the Philippine court had to balance the government's right to govern its own affairs, what we call national sovereignty, against its obligations under international law. They ultimately ruled that the registration requirement was legitimate, but it had to be applied in a way that didn't violate the right to freedom of association.
Which is protected under international law, right?
Right, so even a domestic law can be challenged on the basis of international legal principles.
Wow, so international law really does have teeth.
It can. Okay, now let's switch gears for a minute and talk about something that often causes confusion. The act of state doctrine.
Okay, the act of state doctrine, what is it exactly?
Basically, it's a legal principle that generally prevents courts in one country from judging the validity of acts committed by a foreign government within its own territory.
So even if another country does something that seems wrong, our courts can't really get involved.
Well, generally, no. It's rooted in the idea that states should respect each other's sovereignty and not interfere in each other's internal affairs.
Makes sense, but I'm also seeing in the listener sources that there's some debate about whether the act of state doctrine actually belongs under the umbrella of international law.
Yeah, and there's a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case that addresses this directly. Banco Nacional de Cuba v. Sabatino. The court actually ruled that the active state doctrine is not a principle of international law, but rather a matter of domestic policy.
Wait, a doctrine about respecting other countries' sovereignty isn't part of international law.
It seems counterintuitive, I know. But basically, each country gets to decide for itself how much deference they want to give to actions of foreign governments within their own territory. It's a choice they make, not something dictated by international law.
Interesting. So international law might encourage respecting other countries, but it doesn't tell domestic courts how to handle those situations.
Exactly. And the Sabatino case shows how international legal concepts can influence domestic legal systems, even if they're not hard and fast rules of international law.
Okay, I'm starting to see how complex this all is. International law is definitely more than just a set of clear-cut rules.
It definitely is. It's a dynamic system with a lot of gray areas. And we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, we haven't even touched on fundamental rights and duties of states, treaties, international organizations.
We have a lot more to uncover.
Before we dive into those topics, let's take a quick pause. We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into the fascinating world of international law.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so we're back and ready to keep digging into this world of international law. Looking at all these sources our listeners sent in, it seems like we're getting to the core of how countries are expected to act on the world stage. I mean, we're talking about fundamental rights and duties of states here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is really the foundation of the whole system. It sets the ground rules for how states interact with each other.
So let's start with those basic rights. What are some of the key ones that states have under international law?
Well, one of the most fundamental is the right of existence, integrity, and self-preservation. Basically, it means every state has the inherent right to exist, to maintain its territorial integrity, to protect itself from threats.
So like the right of a country to just be a country without being invaded or taken over.
Exactly. And this right goes hand in hand with the right of sovereignty and independence, the right of each state to govern itself free from outside interference.
Makes sense. No one wants to be a puppet state, right?
Right. And then there's the right of equality, the idea that all states, no matter their size or power, are equal in the eyes of international law.
So a tiny island nation has just as much say as a superpower.
In theory, yes. Of course, power dynamics do come into play in the real world, but that principle of equality is really important for a fair and just international system.
I see that. Now, what about property and jurisdiction? I'm seeing those mentioned a lot in these sources, too.
Right. The right of property and jurisdiction basically gives states authority over their territory, resources, and people within their borders. Think of things like immigration laws, property ownership, even criminal justice.
So it's about a state's ability to control what goes on inside its own borders.
Exactly. And then we have the right of legation, or diplomatic intercourse. It sounds formal, I know, but it's basically the right of states to establish and maintain diplomatic relations with other states.
It's how countries talk to each other, right? Sending ambassadors and setting up embassies.
Precisely. It's crucial for communication, negotiation, and hopefully peacefully resolving disputes.
Okay, so those are the rights. But you mentioned duties, too. Are those kind of the other side of the coin?
Yeah, exactly. For every right a state has under international law, there's a corresponding duty it owes to other states. So, for example, the right of existence comes with the duty to respect the existence of other states. The right of sovereignty means you can't interfere in other states' internal affairs. And the right of equality means treating other states with respect and fairness, no matter how powerful they are.
So it's all about balance. States can't just demand their rights without holding up their end of the bargain.
Exactly. That balance between rights and duties is what helps maintain order and stability in the international system.
Fascinating stuff. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about treaties and international agreements. Our listeners sent in a ton of material on this, covering everything from trade deals to human rights conventions. How do we even begin to understand these things?
Well, think of treaties as contracts between states. They're legally binding agreements that set out rules and obligations on all sorts of issues.
So it's like countries sitting down at the negotiating table and figuring out how they're going to deal with each other.
You got it. And just like with contracts, these treaties have to be negotiated, signed, and then ratified by the countries involved before they actually become legally binding.
I can just imagine those diplomats huddled over stacks of papers, making sure every word is perfect.
Yeah, it can be a very detailed process. So, are there any specific treaty examples from the listener's sources that you're curious about?
Well, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations caught my eye. It seems like a pretty important one.
It is. It establishes the framework for diplomatic immunity, which basically means diplomats serving in foreign countries get special privileges and protections.
Ah, so that's what keeps them from getting arrested in a host country, even if they do something, controversial.
Exactly. It's meant to ensure that diplomats can do their jobs without fear of reprisal or interference. It's crucial for international relations.
That makes a lot of sense. What other treaties stand out to you?
Well, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, is a big one. It aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and promote disarmament. It's been incredibly important in trying to control these incredibly destructive weapons.
It's a pretty big deal, but it hasn't been totally successful, has it? I mean, some countries still have or are trying to develop nuclear weapons.
That's true. The NPT faces challenges, and enforcement can be tricky. But its existence is still crucial. It sets a standard, and it creates a framework for dialogue and cooperation.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move on to the organizations that actually play a role in shaping and enforcing international law. I'm seeing the United Nations mentioned quite a bit in these sources.
Well, the UN is a major player, for sure. It was established after World War II, and its goals are to maintain international peace and security, promote cooperation, and uphold human rights.
Oh yeah, the UN. It's that big building in New York, right?
That's the headquarters, yes. But the UN is much more than just a building. It's a whole system with specialized agencies, programs, and funds all over the world.
So it's not just about preventing wars then. It's involved in all sorts of global issues.
Absolutely. The UN tackles a huge range of challenges, from poverty and hunger to climate change. And a lot of its work is directly related to international law.
Can you give us some concrete examples? Like, how is the UN actually involved in international law?
Sure. One of the most important examples is the International Court of Justice, or ICJ. It's basically the UN's court system.
So like the World Court.
Exactly. The ICJ settles legal disputes between states and provides advisory opinions on legal matters. It plays a huge role in interpreting and applying international law.
That's really interesting. But what happens when a country breaks the rules? What can the UN actually do about it?
Well, they've got a few different tools. There's diplomacy and mediation, for one, but there are also sanctions. And in some cases, they can even authorize military action.
Sounds like they've got options. Can you give us some examples of these different responses to violations of international law?
Your sources actually have some great historical examples. You have a source about the sanctions imposed on South Africa during apartheid, for instance.
Oh, right. That's a good example of how economic and diplomatic pressure can be used to try and create change.
Exactly. And in that case, it was ultimately successful. Apartheid did eventually end.
But it's probably not always that simple, right?
You're right. Sanctions can have unintended consequences, too. You also have a source about the sanctions on Iraq after the Gulf War. They definitely hurt the Iraqi government, but they also caused a lot of suffering for ordinary people.
It's a tough balancing act, I bet. Now, what about these forcible sanctions? Is that just a fancy way of saying going to war?
Well, yes, essentially. The UN Charter does allow for the use of force, but it's always a last resort.
Of course. No one wants to jump straight to war. I noticed our listener included sources on both the Korean War and the Gulf War. Would those be examples of forcible sanctions in action?
Yes, they would. In both cases, the UN Security Council authorized the use of military force. In Korea, it was to defend South Korea from invasion. And in the Gulf War, it was in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait.
And both were conflicts with such devastating consequences. It really makes you think about the weight of those decisions.
Absolutely. And it underscores the importance of international cooperation, diplomacy, and a commitment to finding peaceful solutions whenever possible.
We've covered so much ground already. It's amazing to see how complex this field of international law really is.
It is. But remember, we've really just scratched the surface here.
Uh,
Yeah, it really is a lot to take in, isn't it?
It is, but it's fascinating too. And, we've talked about all these rules and principles, but how do they actually get enforced? What happens when a country breaks those rules?
Right. Well, that's where things get even more complicated. You see, unlike in domestic law, there's no global police force to enforce international law.
So how does it work then?
Well, the international community has to rely on other mechanisms.
Like what?
Well, your sources mentioned sanctions, right?
Yeah, peaceful, enforceable ones.
Exactly. It's kind of like a toolbox with different options depending on the situation.
So let's start with the peaceful ones. What are we talking about here?
Well, think about things like diplomatic protests, recalling ambassadors, even expelling diplomats.
So basically giving a country the cold shoulder on the world stage.
Exactly. It sends a strong message without resorting to force. And then you have economic sanctions, things like trade embargoes, freezing assets, cutting off aid.
Hitting them where it hurts the pocketbook.
Exactly. And sometimes these measures can be very effective.
Like in the case of South Africa during apartheid?
Right. Those sanctions, combined with other international pressure, played a big role in bringing about the end of apartheid.
A powerful example of how international law can be used to promote human rights.
It is. But it's important to remember that sanctions can have unintended consequences as well.
That's true. The sources also mentioned the sanctions on Iraq after the Gulf War, how they caused a lot of suffering for ordinary people.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance finding the right measures and trying to minimize harm to civilians.
Absolutely. Now, what about these forcible sanctions? Is that basically just another way of saying going to war?
Well, yes, essentially, the UN Charter does allow for the use of force, but it's always a last resort and should only be used in very specific circumstances,
Like in self-defense.
right? Or when authorized by the Security Council to maintain or restore international peace and security.
And we see this in both the Korean War and the Gulf War, right?
Exactly. Both cases where the Security Council authorized the use of military force.
And those conflicts had such devastating consequences.
They did, and it really underscores the gravity of those decisions, the importance of exhausting all peaceful options first.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like we've really gone deep on this one, exploring so many different facets of international law.
We have, and it's been a great discussion.
It has, and I think our listener is going to walk away with a much deeper understanding of this complex but incredibly important field.
I hope so.
You know, as we wrap up here, is there anything you would say to our listener as they continue exploring international law?
I'd say stay curious, keep learning, and pay attention to the emerging challenges, the things that are pushing the boundaries of international law, things like cyber warfare, climate change, artificial intelligence. These are the issues that will shape the future.
What a great point. It's a reminder that international law isn't just about the past. It's about the present and the future and how we navigate this increasingly complex world.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure learning from you.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you for taking this journey with us. We hope you've gained some valuable insights into the world of international law and maybe even sparked some new questions along the way. Keep exploring, and until next time, happy deep diving.